Hey, Michaela.
Hi.
Today we're going to do something a little different on the podcast, and we're going to discuss books or podcasts or ideas or anything of that nature that we've been exposed to recently, that we've read, and that we've particularly enjoyed. Something a little bit different from our usual material, although I'm sure undoubtedly it'll be quite related. So I'm curious, what have you been reading, listening to, and enjoying?
um, I think the first thing to be said is that because so much of the things that are happening on Zoom and on the computer, I've kind of abandoned my Kindle and gone back to reading paper books, which I used to love and always did. And then, of course, it became so much more convenient to load everything onto one device and be able to travel with it. But now that we're not really traveling still, I've gone back to paper books, and that's been really, really nice because it also means I can read before I go to bed without getting that light exposure, which we'll talk about in a second, the light exposure. So that's the first thing to be said, is that I'm really enjoying getting paper books again.
I also enjoy the physical books. Of course, I still love my Kindle, I must say, but I also enjoy the physical books. There's something about the tactile nature, the physical nature of it. Also, it's more spatial. Some people say that they find the Kindle easy for reference, taking notes, highlighting, and so on. But I just can't get my head around the spatial component in an e-reader. Whereabouts in the book is it? Somehow, when I'm reading a book and I'm remembering information, or even if plot points or whatever the case may be, something about the physical side of it is relevant for me.
Yes, I feel the same. And I mean, I used to be such an avid collector of books, and I had so many. But then, of course, post fire, I never really replenished my library, and still haven't quite. I mean, not even remotely. The books that I do remember that I had that were just reference books, I do have on the Kindle, but new things and things that I really, really loved, I'm trying to get back in paperback, which is quite nice.
Have you always been a reader? I mean, I was wondering actually, your English, of course, English is not your first language, and your English is very, very good indeed. And I know for a fact that your vocabulary, for instance, exceeds many native speakers. We've known each other many years, and I've heard you use all kinds of very advanced vocabulary. Well, it's true that a lot of native speakers don't use, and so that's quite interesting. And sometimes I've said to you, do you know what that word means actually? And then you give a good definition. And I think it's actually unusual for native speakers to be able to do that. So that's always impressed me. I wondered if you'd acquired that through reading. So anyway, when you were a child, I expect if you read it all, it was in German. Have you always been a reader? And did that contribute somewhat to your acquisition of advanced English?
Well, I've always been a reader, and I've been always just really into books. And when I was a kid, I would spend my allowance on books. So I would save up all my allowance. And then I lived in Salzburg, which is close to the German border. And ever so often, my parents would go to Munich, which was a much, much bigger city than Salzburg. And there used to be this department store where in the basement, there were just books. And so I would hoard my money and then take it with me and just buy as many books as I could afford, and then read all the way back already in the car. And anytime we went on a trip, that was just the perfect way to kind of get a bit more reading in. And I, of course, did the thing that kids at least used to do, which is I had a flashlight hidden in the bed. And when I had to go to bed, I would, turn the light off and then read some more with the flashlight under the covers. And, sometimes not get nearly enough sleep if the book was particularly good. So I've always loved books. And then in some real wonderful set of circumstances, when I moved from Düsseldorf, where I lived for a while, to Hamburg, a lot of the apartment buildings there have storefronts on the bottom, as it is in most of Europe, and then apartments on the top. And the apartment I rented was above a bookstore. And it was just incredible, right? And so I started going in there every Friday, and I would buy 2 or 3 books every Friday and then read them till the next Friday. And, that way amass an enormous amount of reading and also an enormous amount of books. And it was just the best thing, to have like access to a proper bookstore in not only walking distance, but I just had to go down the steps out the door and to the right into the bookstore.
What were you reading at that age? How old were you actually in Dusseldorf? What was that, 19, 20 or so?
Oh, no, I was a bit, 21, 22. So, I read a lot of actual German and Austrian writers. Herman Hesse was definitely something that I read and reread. I know you just got a Herman Hesse, but also just, both contemporary and like the classic Austrian and German writers. I also, back then, they started having these, there were whole editions, like whole publishers that only publish kind of esoteric material. All those books were light blue. It was, I don't know why they were all light blue, but you could have everything from Druid history to astral projection, and like all of that stuff was all available by this one imprint. And so I made my way through, kind of the whole esoteric library that was available, and that was really quite cool because in that particular imprint, they had everything. They had Tibetan, they had Indian, they had Celtic, they had Sufi, they had, when you name it, they had it. So I did a lot of that, just kind of assorted esoteric stuff. And I just also, read quite a bit of German translations of English literature, which is kind of hilarious when I think about it now. But of course, I read in German back then, mostly. And then...
Well, your English wasn't that great, right? Even when you arrived in the US, your English wasn't that great.
Yeah, I mean, my English was the English you learn in school. And then, conversationally apply yourself when you go to England or when you speak with people who are English speakers. So I had a good enough command of the English language that I could get around and express myself and have proper conversations and everything. But by no means did I have, vast vocabulary. But then, of course, when I came to the States, and even a little bit before, I started reading in English. And in the beginning, what I would do is... I actually did this even in German. This is one of the tricks, even in German, that I acquired. I don't know why or how or who told me, but my absolute favorite gift from my dad ever, I think, was a massive encyclopedia when I was 10. It was a kid's encyclopedia, but it was this massive book, and it had like little photos and, maps and things like that. And so anytime I didn't know something, I would look it up in there. This was, of course, pre-Googling everything, right? But so, and I eventually had read that entire thing from the beginning to the end, all the countries and, how many people live there and all of that stuff. And I was just so into where words came from and all of that. I was also a total Latin nerd. Meaning I studied Latin in school, and I taught myself to essentially speak Latin as if it was a living language, and really, really loved that. Translated a lot of Latin books and stuff. So I've always had a thing for it. So when I started learning English, to end my long winding explanation here, I would, anytime I wouldn't know a word, I would immediately look it up. And that, was a bit tedious, but in a fairly short period of time, I had a really vast vocabulary, which helped because I think English is, to me, it's a very interesting language because it has there's a lot of precision in a certain way that German, it has a different kind of precision. It's like, You need a lot more words to describe something. Let's put it this way. English there's something very to the point, and I've always really enjoyed getting more vocabulary and kind of ways to say things that are totally on the spot.
English certainly has many words that can mean the same thing, or roughly the same thing, but with important implications and shades of meaning. And I think the way you communicate, the way you use English, really takes full advantage of that. Very sophisticated use of the implication of language. Because sometimes I'll ask you, because I'm interested in why you choose certain words, especially given that, it's not constantly thinking about that, but sometimes I say, why this word in particular? And I wonder if you mean to include all of its implications. And without fail, I think you've always meant the implications of the word, the subtle implications of the word. And I think that's rather remarkable. And you think that's got something to do with your interest in etymology. You want to know where the word comes from, what's its root, something maybe to do with Latin or Greek very often, isn't it? You think there's some kind of sense in which that is helping you get those shades? Or, I mean, you must have had vast amounts of comprehensible input to pick that context up.
Yeah, I mean, I used to before it got as busy as it's gotten nowadays, I used to always read 2-3 books a week and, sometimes more. And then, of course, long plane rides were dedicated to just reading. And but it's not just that. And that's why I think I also like reading so much, well-written books. Or just, it's like music to me. And before I lost all my books, I had go-to books that evoked a certain kind of a feeling in my body or in my emotions. And I would read that book over and over and over. I would know the exact chapter that I would want to read to evoke a certain kind of a feeling, or to evoke a certain kind of a memory, or a certain kind of an exploration. And so, the same way that you can use music to do that, I always used to do that and still do with books, where it doesn't matter how often I've read it, it's still as good as the first time, either because the language is just so good, or the sentiment is so evocative, or a combination thereof. And when I get to read something that's really well written, it's hard to describe, but it's like this totally, amazing, explosive, opening kind of a feeling. That's like no other, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you find that to be similar with fiction and nonfiction? I mean, you must have a very vivid imagination. You're very visual, aren't you? The way you decorate, for example, your house and everything, you're extremely visual. I mean, does that transfer to your imagination as well?
Yeah. And I mean, it's really quite often it happened that I would read something and really loved a book, for instance, and then they made that book into a movie. And without fail, that would just totally upset me, because the visuals in the book or the people in the book weren't the people that I imagined when reading the book, right? And so it often just totally fell short of my imagination or the way I visualized things in movies. So I no longer even bother looking at movies of books that I really, really loved, because it just never really, compares in some way. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned Herman Hesse, and as you pointed out, I just got this literally just moments before we began recording here. This dual language, of course, in the original German and in English version of Siddhartha, which I'm going to enjoy going through. As you know, I have sufficient German to embarrass myself in front of German speakers, but I like to do it. So I'm curious about that book. You mentioned when I took it out of the post package. I mean, I literally opened the thing when we were on Zoom before we started. You said it was quite impactful for you. I'm wondering about that, and also, what other kind of authors do you remember were in that light blue occult section? I presume there must have been a healthy dose of Steiner, but maybe not.
Yeah. It was Steiner. It was definitely a healthy dose of Steiner, but also there was a lot of, things like I was really into near-death experiences or reincarnation, people remembering their reincarnations, and things like Raymond Moody, or, like all those people who kind of went into what happens after death, or what happens when you come back from a near-death experience, or, all these. There were like a whole bunch of authors in that time in England, actually, which was kind of interesting, because you would think, there would be lots of Indian accounts of that, but it's actually a lot of English authors talking about kids remembering villages they had been in their previous lives and things like that. I was totally fascinated by that. And read a lot about that, and then also got very heavily into regression hypnosis, and I had a very deep appreciation, and this goes back to language, right? I was really into Milton Erickson and the way he used language. That's when I started actually reading English, because it was even translated really, really well. Whoever translated that book, My Voice Will Go With You, wherever, I don't know what it's called in English, actually, that book, even in the German translation, was so, the way he used language to invoke things in the subconscious and to give metaphors without pushing people or forcing them to have recall or experiences, that was amazingly impactful. And then there was also a whole bunch of things in that library that were Steiner related, in the sense that it was like about how to connect with the natural world and how to actually work with the natural world in the realms of not only the esoteric, but also in the practical things, like using the moon phases when you sow seeds, what colors to put seeds on when you put them out, and things of that nature that I was just always really interested in, where herb lore and folklore and the esoteric kind of met. That was always kind of my sweet spot. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, is one of the books I'm reading at the moment, is related to that, which is kind of a new version of those things that I kind of came up with. But I want to talk about Herman Hesse for a second, since you have him there, in the sense that my dad gave me a kind of a collection, like how you could buy, I think that still exists, like these sets of books. They all look the same, and they're like an author's collected works. And so he gave me the collected works of Herman Hesse, probably for my 11th or 12th birthday, right around the same time I read The Mists of Avalon and was so, excited about it. And I made my way through Hesse at that time, and most of it was kind of like, yeah, okay. It was a bit young. And then I think the first book of that entire collection that really, I was a bit young. I was also not a very sophisticated or mature 11 or 12-year-old. I loved reading and things like that, but it wasn't like I thought Hesse was such a revelation or something. But I remember when I read Siddhartha, that actually interested me, and that had a pretty strong impact to the way he describes it, and also his language, and how he has a very interesting way of describing that sitting under the tree, and the kind of the discontent, because I think a lot of the German language definitely lends itself to discontent. Yeah. So I remember that being the first book of Hesse's where I was like, wow, this is really incredible. And that got me onto the trajectory of reading more about the entire, first of all, the entire landscape of that time, and then also, of course, other things about the Buddha. But then, of course, years later, when I reread those books, then, it made a lot more, then it had a lot more impact. And it was quite lovely. Also, the kind of sentiment of my father giving me those books. And I quite till this day enjoy reading one on occasion.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that use of the German language to express discontent. But maybe you could say it something very briefly, for not everyone will know who was Herman Hesse, and what is this book Siddhartha? You don't have to go into great detail, but
well, Herman Hesse was a very prolific and much loved and revered German writer, writing in German and having a really beautiful command of language in German. And Siddhartha is the story of the Buddha, and the way he tells it, which is kind of interesting, because when was that book written? I'm not quite sure, but he wrote the story of the Buddha at a time where in the German literature, that wasn't really happening, right? And he was kind of a mainstream author in the sense that he was revered as a proper literary, you know, I don't know what we would call it, a proper man of writing and literature. And he wrote about the Buddha in a way that he opened that to a lot of Germans.
1922.
Yeah.
It seems it was first published.
Yeah, he was kind of an interesting guy in the sense. I think he had a Nobel Peace Prize as well. He had, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 wives. He was a painter as well. You know, it was kind of really quite interesting. And there's, of course, you know, a few other books that later on made a lot of sense. Damien, for one, I really, really loved.
Yeah. And, you know, around that same time, there was another, I think, quite famous poem, Buddha in der Glorie, by Rilke, 1908.
Yeah.
You know, and it's directed towards the Buddha at the moment of his enlightenment. I don't know. Have you ever heard it? Shall I read it to you?
Well, we have to see about your pronunciation, will we?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, yes, I apparently have poor pronunciation in general. And when I do get it right, it's sort of Northern German inspired flavor. And you hate that, don't you? Oh, yeah, well, it's not your favorite flavor of German. Anyway, well, never mind. Well, let's move on. I asked you originally before we got on this discussion about, you know, your love of books and reading and so on throughout your life. I'd asked you, you know, what have you been reading lately? What have you been exposed to lately that's been interesting?
Well, I've been mostly listening to podcasts when I have a moment, which is typically, you know, before bed or in the bathtub or in the sauna. That's kind of where I've been just listening to some podcast as a means of beefing up on a few different things. So I'll talk about that a bit, because that ties in with also, you know, the not reading on Kindle, but reading paperbacks, so that, you know, there isn't light exposure and things. But the 2 things I have been reading whenever I have a little bit of a moment is this one here, which is such an unbelievably good book. It's called The Garden Awakening by Mary Reynolds. And Mary Reynolds is like an Irish garden and landscape designer. And you know, she came to fame by having an incredibly wild garden at the Chelsea Flower Show. Was it Chelsea? Yeah, I think so. But so she's you know, a garden designer. But what's so really wonderful about this book is that she essentially talks about all the different garden management practices that are, you know, both derived from Steiner, but also, you know, from permaculture and some other older garden culture, you know, ideas like the Hügelgarten and stuff like that, where you're essentially going back and working with nature versus working against nature. And the nice thing about her is that she kind of weaves the entire Celtic sensibility and folklore, and also the Celtic knowledge about doing that, right? Because, like, for instance, you know, Findhorn is, you know, built on Celtic principles. And I mean, Findhorn vegetables are famous for being the biggest and most beautiful and most amazing vegetables, because they're still using those ancient principles, which Steiner drew from as well, with biodynamics, and permaculture draws from on some other, in some other areas, in the way that things are arranged so that the waste of one plant goes into the ground and helps another. So there's the gardening aspect, which I greatly enjoy, since one of the things within the pandemic, of course, has been that I've been home long enough to establish proper gardens and proper vegetable growing and all of that. But the beautiful thing about it is that she ties it in with the body, and with the body and the land becoming familiar, which is, of course, something that I'm really interested in, both personally, and we do a lot of it within teaching, the sensitizing of the body, not only to another human, which is useful, but also to oneself and to the land. And there's all these practices in there, and these considerations on how you walk and how you connect with nature. And it's a very, very beautiful book on many levels. It's very practical on the gardening level, but it's also very opening and enjoyable on the embodiment and merging and combining with nature level. So it's a really, really lovely book, and I'm enjoying it. I'm about halfway through, and it's a book that I'm kind of reading slowly because I'm cherishing it so much, and it's quite nice. So that's one thing that is kind of a hearkening back to those days when I read all these things. And also, of course, some of the training I had with my first teacher, who was, an herb woman in the Celtic tradition. And it's just really lovely.
Could you repeat the title and author, please?
It's called The Garden Awakening, Designed to Nurture Our Land and Ourselves, by Mary Reynolds.
Oh, very interesting.
So, yeah. And very, very appreciative of her. And, it's got things like how do you make fertilizers and fungicides that are natural, and things all the way to rituals and creating parts in the garden. It's one thing in there that I really love, where she talks about going out in your garden in the dark and sitting in your garden in the dark and not having any light on, and, reducing light as much as possible. And she gives instructions on that. And it's just very lovely.
Nice. And have you managed to apply any of that to your garden? I know you've got sort of a citrus, orchard, I suppose. Is that the right word? A citrus orchard? I'm not sure if it's like what is it? A murder of crows, an orchard of citrus. I'm not sure. You can tell me. But do you've got citrus, and you've got all sorts of things, vegetable garden. I don't know. Maybe you could say something about your garden, and have you what you're growing on the ranch there, and if you've applied any of this.
Well, interestingly enough, I bought the ranch with a lot of intact, old growth fruit and avocado trees and citrus trees. And the people who owned the property for close to 70 years, and had actually bought it from his uncle who had homesteaded it. So it's been in the family for a while. And before that, it was just it's an odd area here, because it's both the ground is very fertile, but it's of course quite dry. So they planted essentially in a way that is not conventional, or wasn't conventional at that point, which is quite aligned with permaculture principles, in the sense that they essentially planted what is sometimes called a food forest. Meaning they planted things fairly close together so that one thing would shade another. And they planted behind a big oak tree so that the citrus wouldn't get burned by the really, harsh south-facing sun. So I inherited a property that was quite disordered, in the sense that, things weren't properly lined up and all, planned out. They just planted something and then they planted something else. But it actually works in a way that there is an established food forest, and all I had to do is, plant a few things. I lost a bit during the fire, obviously, so I've been replanting fruit trees, mostly stone fruit trees, and things of that nature. But I have pomegranates growing right next to walnuts, growing right next to avocados, growing right next to grapefruit, with oranges in between, and then the stone fruit and some almonds, and so it's this whole thicket of trees, which take quite a bit to manage, but it's very beautiful. So I had a kind of a renewed appreciation for how the people who I got the land from actually did that, and the fact that I don't really mess with it and I don't prune a lot, and I of course have animals who fertilize the trees ongoingly, which also really helps, and my pigs essentially eat whatever drops that I don't harvest, or that is already the squirrels eaten, or things like that. I have a lot of that going on, which was nice. The thing that I really like about her in this book, also, she talks about something that I'd heard before. Paul Stamets with all the mushrooms talks about it, and she talks about it, and I had probably heard it from Steiner because I remember it from far, far, far back when. But there's this whole idea that when you walk barefoot in your vegetable gardens, or in your gardens in general, but I do it in my vegetable garden, the mycelium and the ground, and the mycelium in the ground essentially picks up what nutrients you're lacking or what nutrients you need. And so the working barehanded and barefoot in the garden is considered giving information to the plants, so that the plants can, when you do it all naturally, the plants can support you. And I don't know if that's true or not scientifically, but it's, I think, a very beautiful and wonderful idea to consider a deeper kind of connection there via the bare feet and the connection to the ground. And I like that idea a lot. Doesn't, to me, makes no difference is it scientifically proven or not. I think it's a way to evoke the connection and the mutual information and the mutual appreciation between a human and the plants that feed me. I am fairly self-sufficient when it comes to fruit and vegetables. I don't really have to buy anything in the summer months. Supplement in the winter, but in the summer months I have excess of everything that I can share.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And so what else have you got there?
The other thing I'm reading, this is kind of a bit obscure. It's a book called Sonora, an Intimate Geography by David Yetman, who is a research social scientist at the University of Arizona Southwest in Tucson. I don't know if he's still there. This book is older, I think. And it's an entire book about the Sonoran Desert and its people, 1996. So I'm assuming David Yetman has probably become a professor or done something else. But this is a really, really wonderful book because he kind of not only describes the landscape and the fauna and the flora, but also the people and the art and the kind of crafts, from the weaving of the hats to the way the buildings are painted, and why icons, talks about the native peoples, the different landscapes, and of course talks about how that's being eroded by, modern culture and things like that, and how it transforms. And it's just an incredibly beautiful book. And of course, the Sonoran Desert goes from the water all the way inland. So it goes from super arid to the ocean. And there's some really amazing culture. And I just love this book so much because of the way he brings things to life. And there's also a lot of herbal healer stories in there. And there's actually a companion book, which I've just gotten, that's essentially the ethnobotanical account of that area. and that he also wrote, that I just really enjoy. So as you can see, there's the Virgin of Guadalupe, and down here is this kind of offering shrine that's very much looks like what you have in Bhutan, where you burn the the shrubbery and stuff like that. So it's a nice book, and it's it's very well done and written, and makes me want to go travel immediately. And I'm planning on going once I can.
Sonora by David Yetman.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Published 1996. Great. I know you had at least one other thing on your list, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot, obviously, because I've been quite enjoying podcasts. Not yours, sorry. I'm enjoying your podcast too. But aside from your podcast, I've been enjoying podcasts by Andrew Huberman, who is Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is a professor at Stanford, and who has a podcast that's gotten, I think, very popular. I remember in the very, very beginning when I first came upon it, it wasn't nearly as popular as it's now.
You liked Dr. Huberman before it was cool to like Dr. Huberman, is what you're saying.
I listened to Dr. Huberman before it was cool to listen to Dr. Huberman. Well, I think it was probably always cool, but I've seen the thing explode, and rightly so, because it's quite well done in the sense that he's able to really collect information and impart it in a way that allows people to understand what's happening without having to read research papers, and also kind of compile it in a way that it's really useful for anything you want to optimize. And there's a few strains that I really enjoy. There's some things, I'm just not personally that interested in, but there's a few strains I really enjoy. And one of them is kind of the optimizing of the body for health and vitality and well-being via the circadian rhythm. And that's been hugely helpful to me in the time that we've been teaching, online, where essentially I have to get up really, really early. In the first year of the pandemic, I'd get up at 12:30 a.m. and start teaching at 1 a.m., teach till 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning, then sleep a few hours, and then teach again from 1 in the afternoon till 7 in the evening. And so that really messed up my sleep cycles. Really, substantially messed up my sleep cycles. Well, and the reason we did that, of course, was that we wanted to support the people that we usually saw live in person in Europe and the UK and Australia in their time zones, because I wanted to make sure that in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, where things were really scary, right? We didn't know what was happening, and everybody was isolated and locked in, that there was a kind of a through line in the material and in the teaching, and also in the support, both us with them and them with each other, right? And so all our established groups were just kept at the time that they were when we used to go to Amsterdam or when we used to go to Melbourne. And that, of course, meant for you staying up really late and for me getting up really early. And in the context of the getting up really early, I really messed up my circadian rhythms and my sleep, and it over the years, because first it was like, well, this is going to last a few months and then we'll be back on the road. And then it didn't take a few months. And then in the next year, we still had to do online. And then we moved it back to me getting up at 3 instead of 12:30, but nonetheless. And so saying all of that, I came upon Dr. Huberman before then, but then he brought this one episode out that was all about light and optimizing light and sleep. And he was talking about shift workers and all of that. And it was kind of an interesting thing, because I listened to it, and it was on one end very affirming and the other end scared the living daylights out of me, pun intended, because there's such bad health risks in that kind of, blue light exposure at night, and not sleeping properly, or getting up really early and getting bright light in my eyes and stuff like that. So I've been really immersing into those aspects on how do you use light, when do you use light, how do you use sunlight, how to use the light when the sun goes down, what are the things you can do to guard against, those kind of detrimental effects. And then in combination with that, cold exposure and hot exposure. And that's been kind of the thing that I'm listening to and beefing up on all around, so that I can somewhat optimize the situation, even though it's not optimal, of course, still with the getting up early and all of that. So I've been really enjoying that. And then the second thing that he's just started doing that I also really appreciate is because, of course, my background is trauma therapy and psychology, and the more clinical applications of that was where I started in my 30s, late 20s and 30s. So he now has a whole bunch of podcasts out on things like OCD, so the more psychiatric aspects, trauma based on research, not trauma based on everybody being trauma informed now, but really, how does it work in the brain? What happens? What doesn't happen? How do you work with it? With supplements, how do you work with it behaviorally? What do you need to understand? So he's very good, even though, it's not as somatically driven as I would like it to be. It's very good from a science and neuroscience perspective to kind of give a bit of underpinning, for people who don't have that underpinning. It's very easy to understand. So I'm quite, quite appreciative of him doing that, because it's so, so precise and so applicable.
Yeah, you sent me, over the last weeks, you sent me his episode on depression. He had one on ADHD, recently bipolar. Very interesting. And they're quite long. They're like 2-3 hours of sort of, and sometimes he'll interview experts. Now, who was that expert that you thought was really, really good that he interviewed?
Dr. Conti, who is really an incredible trauma specialist, psychiatrist, trauma specialist, who I had read things about or from before, I should say, and who's just really, really good and clear and, precise without going too far into everybody needs to be medicated, or, everybody needs to whatever. Whatever it is, there's these like far divergent aspects of how people think trauma should be treated. So that was really good. And then the other one I really liked was Dr. Sameer Hattar, I think. Hattar. Sorry that I'm bastardizing his name. So Dr. Sameer Hattar was another one that was really good, who is, working with circadian rhythms and how that actually creates biological changes in the body. And there was some really good and useful things in there. There's lots of really good ones that I'm enjoying, but there's a few highlights.
I'm curious what you took from, you were, and still do sometimes when we're teaching, which is often, basically it's a sort of shift work pattern for you, but it's a shift work pattern that occurs for a few days and then doesn't occur for another week or so. And so it's, you're in an interesting position getting up and going to bed at these strange times. So what are the key takeaways that you've implemented from particularly your research into how to optimize sleep and circadian rhythms, etc., and light exposure and so on?
Yeah, I think the things, that were both very useful and also quite depressing for me was that I realized that in the context of doing this almost every weekend, right, there were like stretches of time where we taught every single weekend, that I couldn't have a different schedule during the week than I had on the weekend. And the reason I'm saying that's very depressing was that I had to go to bed very, very early, way earlier than I usually would. I tend towards wanting to go to bed really late because I enjoy the evening hours and I enjoy having that stretch of time at the end of the day to do creative things and read and hang out. So I essentially learned that the only way that I could work with my rhythm was to actually have regular sleep and wake hours, which you always hear, but I never believed. So, there's always these things where you think, yeah, well, whatever, right? Have a sleep routine. But I actually created a sleep routine and I went down at the same time, regardless if I could sleep or not. And I also understood finally why you have to wind down, because it all has to do with light exposure, right? And getting light exposure so that it works with your biology and not against your biology. Meaning, if you want to have proper sleep, you can't have bright lights, at least the hour before you sleep, but probably before then even, because it sets different mechanisms in motion in your brain. And so I kind of had to learn how to really diminish or reduce light exposure in the evening. I'd get like late afternoon sunlight, which signals to the brain the sun's going down because it's got a different color. And then, all kinds of chemistry starts working towards winding you down. And then, of course, there's the whole thing with melatonin finally kicking in and getting you into sleep. And then in the morning, the first thing up was bright light exposure. And I still do that every morning. I have this tea table that points right out towards the sunrise, and I open the windows. So you're also supposed to really get the full spectrum of light, not the filtered light from energy efficient windows, for instance. So I open the windows and I sit there and I actually have my first cup of tea as the sun goes up or even before the sun goes up. And then I just sit there and have 10, 15 minutes of bright sunlight, obviously not looking into it, but, just bright sunlight on me. Obviously not looking into it, right? But that's been super, super helpful in setting my entire body up where, the thing that needs to happen, which is I get fully awake, and then, and that sets into effect the going down at the end of the day. And the same now, now that I'm here and when I'm teaching, I have the doors open towards the sunrise. So even if I have to teach, I get bright sunlight as the sun comes up. And that's been super useful. And then the other thing that's very instrumental there is that if you get bright light 2 hours, more than 2 hours before you wake up, then it resets you in a way that you can't go to bed early the next evening, and so on and so on. And that was the hardest thing, because I would certainly wake up 2 hours before I would normally get up, and then, have to go to bed again at 7 p.m. to wake up at midnight or 1 o'clock, and couldn't. And so I realized that I had to essentially reset my entire system such that I could have my first ring light exposure 2 hours before I would usually get up. And that's made a huge difference in the way my body feels. It's a bit pesky, but it certainly had really positive health effects now that I figured that one out and I can do it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One of the key points that you're bringing up there is the way you wake up, or conditions that occur around your waking up influences actually hormone releases and so on at nighttime, all that time later in the day.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. So I've started to, based on your enthusiasm for this, I've started to integrate a bit of that. Mainly when I get up in the morning, I get up and the first thing, of course, I do is get the coffee going, and that'll take 5 or 6 minutes when that's on the hob. And so then I just turn around, and of course I live on a boat, so I just open my side hatch, which is a sort of waist high side hatch window that opens up, and I'll just kind of hang out of that. I mean, when I say hang out of it, I mean I lean out of it and blink into the sun, or blink into the open air. as the coffee is bubbling in the background. So, one can see me hanging out of my side hatch. Of course, as a redhead person, 10 to 15 minutes of daylight exposure is about my weekly allowance. So, I have to be careful. But I have begun to implement some of these ideas thanks to your reporting back about it. Very cool.
Yeah, it's really made a big difference in my sleep cycles as well, and in the depth of sleep. And for a while there, I would check. I no longer do that because it really freaks me out. I would keep my Fitbit on. I have one of those advanced Fitbits and check on my sleep. And it was like really disastrous there for a while with constant waking up because of the disruption of those sleep cycles. And then when I had it somewhat dialed in, I stopped because it's just, it's just not useful to check how often I woke up in the middle of the night and stuff. But I'm definitely sleeping a lot better and have a lot more energy in the day. And, just from that. And then there's other things to do with it, like cold exposure and hot exposure and things like that keep me at least on the straight and narrow while, those early morning teaching hours are still happening.
Okay, very briefly, what is the cold and hot exposure you're doing?
So the things I do is I do cold exposure, daily cold exposure, just enough so that, I get the benefits, but not so much that I get cold tolerance, because the problem is when you get cold adapted, all those massive benefits of those cold, of the cold exposure kind of diminish some. There's other ones, but from what I want, which is the strengthening of the immune system and the kind of revving of the metabolism early in the day, you want short cold exposure. And so I do that. I have this kind of glorified feed trough with cold water in it that I dump a bag of ice in, and then I dip in there for like 5 minutes first thing when I'm done with all my morning stuff.
Well, you do a full-on cold dip, not just a cold shower.
No, I can't do a cold shower. It's just too
cold.
Horrible. It's just not that, it's much nicer to actually, I like that going into the cold and that, whoa, right? And it's just so, it's also a total pattern interrupt, right? Or like a thought interrupt. So often I do it after I've done my first round of email and I'm all like, I go and I have this dip. I do it like 3-4 times a week where I just sit and I'd sit for a couple of minutes and then I get out and then I cover the thing back up. And, then that's that. And then when I can, I do sauna in the evening as the last thing before I go to bed. And I just stay in there for however long I feel like it, but a minimum of 20 minutes. But often, I get into a podcast and just listen to half a podcast or something while hanging out in the sauna. And I go out and I have a garden hose and or if the ice is still somewhat intact, which it typically isn't because it's crazy hot right now, I might just take another cold dip and, go cold, hot, and then I go to bed.
And that's for optimal immune function. And what else is that for?
Well, hot, I grew up with sauna. My dad had a sauna in his basement. My grandfather had a sauna. Right? It was in many parts of Europe, sauna is considered one of the main things you do to keep yourself from getting colds or flus, or keep your immune system going, and you scrub your skin in the sauna and the whole thing. So I kind of use it as a means of sweating. It's good for cardiovascular health. It's good for your skin. I have I had a sauna built out of the scrap wood of my construction wood. So it's this little barrel and I have red lights in it. So I get like red lights while I'm in the sauna, which is good for the skin and for your eyes now as well, I heard. So there's all of those kind of things, but it's also just really nice because it keeps me from, just watching something and zoning out and then getting the light again and blah, blah, blah. So it's just been really a good routine while I'm home as a means of also connecting back with my body in the evening. And sometimes I do a little bit of nonlinear. When it gets too hot, I go on the ground and do a little bit of nonlinear in the sauna. And I drink lots of water in there, and it's just a nice way to end my day.
Very cool. Well, speaking of nonlinear, we should mention that actually we're soon to be running a nonlinear teacher training program we've done now for some years, graduating many teachers of nonlinear movement method all over the world. And that the early bird ends quite soon. Actually, of course, if you're listening to this many years in the future, well, maybe we have another one coming up. So you should check www.michaelaboehm.com, go to the workshops tab, and you'll find everything about it there. We'll also, of course, include a link below. Is there anything you want to say about that upcoming teacher training? We've tweaked it a lot.
Yeah, we've tweaked it a lot, and I think why it's worth mentioning in the context of optimizing health and well-being. There's an optimizing of mental health, of course, that happens in all the things that I'm talking about as well, because it certainly was rough for everyone during the pandemic, and still considering everything that's going on, optimal physical things of optimizing physical procedures is one aspect, and then nonlinear, kind of the bridge between the body and the emotion, and of course also the mind, has been super useful for both me, as the creator of that, but also in being able to give it to people in sessions and teaching people how to do it for other people, because it is one of those modalities that creates that feeling into the inner landscape, and that allows for, kind of an all-over wellness. And that's something I'm really happy about, that we were able to create, not only for people to do in the pandemic at home as an hour session, but also to make it so people can learn how to teach it, and then teach it to their communities and friends and patients and clients. So we've tweaked it a lot. It's really comprehensive, comes with a huge portal of information, videos, the lectures, adjunct material, playlists, you name it. So we have this online support and it's live online training.
It's a real immersion in the method. You do a lot of practicing off the method, and people really value that, as well as, of course, we train you how to teach it. And one of the perks of these trainings is, if you've attended one, you can audit future ones. You can come back and attend future ones at no charge. We do that so that our teachers out there are always able to access a refresher, if you like. But it's turned out that a lot of people have done that and will audit the training just because of that immersion aspect, just because of the depth of practice that goes on in that training. So it's really cool. And if you're interested in that, do check it out, michaelaboehm.com, or send us an email at workshops@michaelaboehm.com. Well, this has been super fascinating. Thank you, Michaela, for sharing what you've been reading. And see you next time.
See you next time.